The metal doors of the transport truck slammed open with a bang, and the first German POW stepped down into the fog. His breath caught. They had all braced for it. The snarling dogs, the blows, the shouted curses. That's what they were told to expect from the British. "You'll beg for death," a sergeant had warned back in the ruins of Cologne. But here in the Dorset countryside, what met them was silence. Then a calm voice. "This way, lads." The British guard, barely older than the prisoners, spoke with clipped courtesy, not cruelty. His rifle was slung low, his eyes unreadable. No kicking, no screaming. Only order, only quiet. The prisoner's heart pounded. Was this a trick? Then came the second shock. A warm cup of tea passed from gloved hands. Hot, sweet, real. One man began to weep. Not from fear, but confusion. This was not the enemy they had imagined. This was something far more dangerous. Dignity. The boat rocked gently as it pulled into the southern English harbour, the morning mist still clinging to the water like a veil. The German soldiers, no longer soldiers really, just thin, ragged young men in patched grey uniforms, stood in tense silence. The journey across the channel had been short, but it had felt eternal. Every creak of the ship, every shout in English, every clang of boots above them had rung with dread. They remembered the warnings, that the British would make examples of them, that humiliation would come before punishment, that kindness would be the bait before cruelty. Some had heard that prisoners were paraded through London, spat on by crowds. Others said the British used dogs. A few whispered that they starved men slowly in dark cells beneath castles. The uncertainty gnawed at them more than hunger ever had. When they disembarked, they were met not with shouts or rifles aimed high, but with a line of quiet soldiers in neat uniforms, hands resting calmly on the stocks of their weapons. One British corporal read out names in a clipped tone, marking them on a clipboard without even raising his eyes. There was no barking, no glares, just routine. A few of the Germans exchanged glances. Was this indifference or restraint before the real punishment began? They were led to waiting trucks, where the engines purred steadily. The roads that wound through the countryside seemed impossibly intact. No craters, no smoke, no burned-out husks of villages. Trees lined the lanes like silent guardians, and wild flowers spilled from hedges as if the war had never touched this place. Inside the trucks, the prisoners sat on wooden benches, gripping their knees. No one spoke. The only sound was the rumble of the road and the occasional cough. When the trucks stopped and the camp gates came into view, many stiffened. This was it, they thought. The punishment would begin now. But what rose before them wasn't a prison, at least not the kind they had braced for. The fences were there, yes, and the guard towers, but the path leading into the camp was swept clean. The buildings were made of stone, not wire and wood. The grass was trimmed, paths lined with gravel. It looked more like a school or a monastery. One man at the back of the group muttered, "Is this where they break us?" As they were led through the main gate, the scent of toast wafted from somewhere nearby, mingling with the faint bite of morning dew. That smell alone nearly unmade them. Toast. Real bread. One man swallowed hard, trying to chase away the memory it triggered. His mother standing in a Dresden kitchen years ago, before the sirens, before the smoke. He had not seen, let alone smelled, toast in years. A young British officer approached them, his uniform pressed to an almost unnatural crispness. He held a clipboard, not a baton. "You'll be given quarters," he said in slow, careful German. "You'll be fed shortly. Don't wander without a guard." Then he stepped aside and let them pass. His tone had been firm, but without malice. No snarling, no performance of superiority. The prisoners filed past him, blinking as they entered the compound. Inside, the world made even less sense. The mess hall was a long brick building with smoke gently curling from its chimney. A few British soldiers stood outside drinking tea from enamel mugs, chatting in low voices. They barely acknowledged the Germans. It was as if they weren't enemies, weren't even worthy of spectacle, just new arrivals to be processed like parcels. The barracks they were assigned to were clean and cold, the bunks already made. Mattresses, blankets. Each man had a cot, a small footlocker, and a ceramic mug placed beside a wash basin. There were no chains, no shouting, just the rhythmic crunch of boots on gravel as the guards patrolled with a kind of bored precision. One prisoner, Franz, barely 21, sat down on the edge of his cot and stared at the mug. He reached out, ran his finger over its rim and whispered, "What is this place?" No one answered. Outside, a bell rang, and somewhere close, the smell of toast grew stronger. They moved in file toward the administration block, boots crunching on gravel that had been raked clean. No one yelled at them to hurry. No one slammed a baton against the wall. The guards simply waited, still composed, like clock hands frozen at the right time. Inside the building, the air was cool and smelled faintly of ink and soap. A British sergeant, seated behind a desk, adjusted his glasses and motioned for them to approach one by one. Names were taken, birthplaces confirmed, dates of enlistment quietly marked down in ledgers. There were no accusations, no interrogations, only formality, as if they were checking into a hotel and not registering for captivity. One by one, the Germans were processed, their few possessions laid out on white cloths, combs, worn letters, dog tags, photographs bent at the corners. Each item was catalogued with care, returned gently unless it posed a risk. When one man flinched as a guard reached for his knapsack, the guard blinked in confusion. "Just looking," he said. Not a bark, not a blow. Franz stepped forward, hands at his sides. The British sergeant looked up and offered a faint nod. "Name? Kruger. Franz Kruger." The sergeant wrote it down, then glanced up again. "Thank you, Mr. Kruger. Step that way, please." Franz didn't move. Not at first. The words struck him like a blow more shocking than any slap. Mr. Kruger. Not prisoner. Not German. Not even Nazi. Just Mr. He blinked, unsure he'd heard correctly. Then, without a word, he walked where the guard had pointed. That night, lying in his bunk, the phrase played again and again in his head. Mr. Kruger. He turned it over like a coin, waiting for the tarnish, the catch. But there was none. Only the polite cadence of a language he had been taught to fear. He wasn't sure if it made him feel seen or exposed. Around him, the others were just as unsettled. There had been no beatings, no forced shouting of allegiance, no propaganda reels, just clean beds, warm food, and silence. That silence was its own kind of weapon. In the following days, the routine unfolded with near military precision, though not their military. The British style was colder, quieter, almost indifferent. Reveille sounded at dawn. Roll call happened like clockwork. No one screamed at them to line up straighter. The guards counted them quickly, made notes, and moved on. Discipline without rage, authority without hate, that, more than anything, twisted in their chests. German discipline had always come with fury, blistering shouts, threats, fists pounding on desks. They had been told that without fear, men became weak. Yet here the British maintained order with nothing more than notebooks and clipped commands. It was terrifying in its own way. There was no emotion to latch onto, no rage to mirror with defiance. Just civility, the kind that made you feel ridiculous for flinching. One afternoon, a prisoner named Weber returned from a supply check and sat down in the barracks looking pale. When asked what had happened, he whispered. He held the door for me. A British corporal. Held the bloody door. The others stared, and he said, "After you, sir." The room fell into silence. No one laughed, no one scoffed, because they all knew it was happening to them too. Respect, that strange, unbearable thing. And respect was harder to fight than cruelty. Cruelty invited hate. But this discipline laced with decency, left them without a weapon, without even a reason. Every small kindness forced them to remember that the enemy might not be a monster. And if the enemy wasn't a monster, what did that make everything they had been told? It started with a cough. Shallow at first, then deep and wet, echoing through the barracks one damp morning before roll call. The man, Vogel, a former railway technician from Hamburg, tried to hide it in his blanket. But by the second day he was hunched over, pale, lips tinged blue. The others gave him space, unsure what the British would do. Would they isolate him? Punish him? Leave him to rot as an example? But when the guard named Collins noticed Vogel's limp on the way to breakfast, he didn't shout. He didn't drag him to his feet or call for discipline. He simply walked over, placed a hand on Vogel's shoulder, and said something softly. None of the Germans understood it all, but they caught the tone. Concern. Within an hour, a medic arrived. An actual medic. Not with a syringe full of punishment, but with tea, bandages, and a jar of something that smelled like menthol. Vogel recoiled at first, his whole body tense. But the medic only smiled faintly, applied a compress, and moved on. Vogel got better, but the questions got worse. That night, the barracks buzzed in low voices, the way only fear or confusion could stir. Franz sat on the edge of his bunk, rubbing his hands together as if to summon reason from friction. He helped him. Someone muttered. A guard. Helped him like a friend. Another voice, barely more than breath, added, "They don't have to. That's what scares me." They had all expected to be hated. It made sense. Hate could be handled. But this strange, inconsistent mercy left them defenseless, because there was no counterattack for kindness, no retort, only silence. As the days passed, the facade of British indifference began to slip in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. A guard named Thompson, lean and sunburnt, occasionally offered a cigarette to the men working latrine duty. He never lingered, never smiled too long, just handed one over and walked on like it was no big thing. But it was. It was everything. One prisoner accepted the cigarette and held it for several minutes before lighting it, staring at it like it might vanish. In the evenings, inside the dim glow of the barracks, the whispered confessions began. Words exchanged in the dark, as if the night itself were safer than daylight truth. "They held the gate for me," someone said. "Didn't even look at me with disgust." Another admitted, "I've never seen anyone smoke so calmly before, like nothing ever touches them." Franz listened, saying nothing, but inside, a weight was building. He thought of the men who had trained them in Saxony, shouting about British brutality. He remembered the posters with twisted caricatures, the radio voices promising death before dignity. And yet here, in this strange, clean place, the enemy passed you a cigarette and asked if you were well. It didn't feel like mercy. It felt like an undoing. One day Franz was given paper to write home. He sat for a long time, the pencil unmoving in his hand. What could he say? The truth would sound like madness, that they had toast for breakfast, that they were allowed to walk in lines without being screamed at, that their guard said, "Please." When he finally began to write, the first sentence came haltingly. "They treat us with honor. I don't know why." That was the heart of it. The shame wasn't from cruelty. It was from being spared it, from being offered something that felt more human than what he had known in uniform. If you're watching this far, let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. Are you watching from Germany, the UK, somewhere far across the world? We'd love to know. And if stories like this move you, please give this video a like, hit the subscribe button right under the player, and click the notification bell so you never miss a moment from our forgotten WWII archives. With your support, we can keep uncovering more stories like this. The mess hall was warm, not just from the stoves lining the far wall, but from something less tangible. Steam, routine, and a quiet that pulsed like breath. The POWs shuffled in with caution still hard-wired into their movements, their boots thudding softly on the stone floor. They kept their eyes low. They expected the moment to change, to tilt suddenly back toward hostility. But instead it was breakfast. Real breakfast. Boiled eggs, toast stacked in neat piles, dishes of marmalade catching the sun like amber. A tall British cook ladled out porridge into tin bowls, then poured tea into thick mugs. Another guard handed out hard-boiled eggs, their shells gently warm in the hand. The smell of butter hung in the air, impossibly rich, impossibly real. Franz hesitated as he moved down the line, his eyes drawn to the slabs of bread. They weren't grey. They weren't mixed with sawdust or stretched with barley husks. They were soft, white, and real. At the end of the line, he was handed a cup of tea. He stared into the dark liquid. The last time he'd tasted tea, real tea, not dried leaves boiled 3 times, he had still been a student, before the uniform, before the smoke. Around him, the other prisoners sat in long rows, heads bent, hands trembling as they lifted spoons and mugs. There was no talking, only the scrape of tin on tin, the clink of enamel, the occasional cough muffled by steam. It was too much to make sense of. No one shouted at them to eat faster. No one shoved. The guards stood nearby, drinking their own tea, sometimes seated at adjacent tables. The message was clear, though unspoken. You may be prisoners, but you will not be treated as animals. Halfway down the hall, one man, Otto, a factory foreman turned infantryman, bit into a piece of toast slathered with marmalade. He froze. The sweetness struck like lightning. His lip trembled. He set the toast down, covered his face, and wept. Not loud, not with drama, just the quiet, crumpling sob of someone who had forgotten what kindness could taste like. Another prisoner reached out, awkwardly placing a hand on his back, not saying a word. Everyone had their own version of that moment. For some, it came with the butter. For others, it was the jam. Franz felt it with the tea, the bitterness cut through by milk and sugar, a taste that didn't belong in war. They ate slowly, reverently. The portions weren't extravagant, but they were enough. More than enough for men who had survived on soup so thin it left their mouths dry. But it wasn't the calories that haunted them. It was the civility, the care, and the inescapable fact that the guards sat down and ate beside them. Not apart, not at elevated tables, just beside. Franz caught a glance from one of them, a red-haired corporal with tired eyes. And the man nodded once, as if to say, "I see you." Then he took a bite of his own toast and looked away. The power of that gesture was impossible to explain. Back home, even civilians with ration books had sneered at soldiers who had surrendered. Weakness was shame. Captivity was cowardice. But here, in enemy hands, there was no sneering, no posturing, only the shocking, steady rhythm of being treated like a man. That afternoon, Franz sat in his bunk, the memory of the meal still fresh on his tongue. He didn't know if it was mercy or manipulation. But he knew one thing. Cruelty was easy to understand. Toast and tea, those were harder. Those he couldn't explain. The paper felt heavy in Franz's hands. though it was thin and war-issued, the kind of stationery meant to vanish easily if it ever needed to. He had sat staring at it for nearly an hour, pencil untouched. Others around him hunched at the long table, scribbling in small, tight lines, muttering to themselves in the silence of shame. They were allowed to write home. 1 letter, a page, no more. Censored, of course, and everyone knew it. But still, words were being offered. A chance to speak through the barbed wire, to reach across the channel and whisper, "I'm alive." But what could they say? Some chose to lie. "The food is poor. The guards keep their distance. It is cold." But those lies didn't land well, even on the page. Others, like Franz, tried the truth in half measures. He had written a single sentence, and then stopped. "We are being treated fairly." Even that felt like betrayal. Outside, autumn leaves clung to the corners of the barracks yard, swirling gently as boots passed over them. The wind brought with it the scent of laundry, clean shirts drying on lines, British soap, sharp, sweet. Franz had used it that morning in the washroom, the lather foreign, smooth. He had stared at the bar as he'd scrubbed, thinking of his wife, Marta, and their small tin bathroom in Frankfurt. There, soap had been a luxury for over a year. Here, it was folded on a towel as if it meant nothing. And yet, it meant everything. He felt it clinging to his skin, mocking him. One man, Müller, refused to take his full ration at lunch. He pocketed his bread instead, stuffing it into the lining of his coat. Someone asked him why. "Because Marta is probably queuing for turnips," he snapped. "Because Hans hasn't eaten meat in a year, and I just had eggs, 2 of them." His voice cracked, and he looked away. Later that night, Franz saw him crumble that same piece of bread into his tea and drink it slowly, not for hunger, but penance. None of them spoke about it openly, but the guilt was relentless. The comfort chipped at them in places pride couldn't protect. The shame was not in being captured. It was in surviving too well. And yet, in this upside-down world, there were moments that made the guilt worse, not better. One Sunday afternoon, as the sky dipped into a soft grey drizzle, a British chaplain visited the camp. He wasn't dressed like a soldier. No rifle, no orders. Just a long coat, a small Bible under his arm, and a face weathered more by kindness than war. He didn't preach, didn't interrogate. He simply stood in the courtyard and said, "If anyone wishes for prayer, I'm available. Not here to convert, just to listen." The offer spread like smoke. Some scoffed, others turned their backs, but a few approached, quietly, cautiously. And when the chaplain listened to their words they couldn't even write to their own families, it felt like a kind of truce, not with the enemy, but with themselves. Franz didn't go forward that day, but he watched from the doorway. He watched as one of the youngest men, barely 18, whispered something and broke down. The chaplain didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder, saying nothing. Later, Franz wrote a new sentence in his letter. "The British do not ask for worship. They offer it." He didn't know if it would pass the censors. He wasn't even sure what it meant. But it felt like something close to the truth. And in a world that no longer made sense, that was enough. The next morning, the air was crisp and full of the scent of damp soil. The guards moved through the yard, calling names from a list for work details. The word itself made the men tense. In Germany, work in a camp had meant punishment, hauling rocks, digging trenches, breaking down under the weight of cruelty disguised as labor. But here, there were no whips, no dogs, no shouted orders. The guards simply pointed to a lorry idling near the gate and said, "Fields today. Potatoes. Bring gloves if you've got them." The men climbed aboard, uncertain, every muscle braced for the blow that never came. The truck rumbled out through the gates, down narrow English lanes lined with hedgerows. The countryside stretched wide and green, rolling hills, thatched cottages, fields divided by stone fences. The war felt impossibly far away. When they reached the fields, a British sergeant showed them where to start and handed out spades. "You dig, we haul," he said, and then he lit a cigarette and turned his back, humming something that sounded like a lullaby. Franz bent to his task. The earth was heavy, but it was clean, rich with worms and roots. His hands burned, but it wasn't from lashes, it was from effort, honest effort. Hours passed in quiet rhythm. Shovel, lift, breathe. The guards did not bark. The only sound was wind moving through the hedges and the dull thud of spades hitting soil. For the first time in years, the labor didn't feel like degradation. It felt like life asserting itself. At midday, the sergeant called a break. Bread, cheese, apples, tea poured from a battered kettle. The prisoners sat in a circle, sweat streaking their faces. Their arms streaked with dirt. The guard walked among them, counting with a glance, and then said, almost casually, "You work well. You'll be paid tomorrow. Camp scrip." The word paid hung in the air like a foreign language. None of them understood. Prisoners didn't earn wages. Captives didn't get currency. But the next day, when they returned from the fields, each man was handed a small piece of paper stamped with the camp's emblem. It wasn't much, just a slip of printed value. But it might as well have been gold. That evening, Franz stepped into the camp store for the first time. It was a small wooden hut with shelves behind a wire counter. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and soap. Inside, the British quartermaster looked up and nodded once. "What'll it be, mate?" he asked. Franz didn't understand every word, but he recognized the tone. Not command, conversation. On the shelf he saw things he hadn't seen in years: bars of chocolate, tins of biscuits, pencils, combs, soap wrapped in brown paper. He stood frozen, overwhelmed by the absurdity of it. Choice. The enemy was offering him choice. His hands trembled as he pointed to the soap. The quartermaster took his scrip, handed over the bar, and said, "Smells better than you lot, anyway." There was a flicker of a grin, half jest, half truth. And for the first time, Franz laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was human. That night, as he washed his hands with the new soap, he thought of Marta again. She would have traded a week's ration book for this. The scent filled the barracks, sharp and clean. It wasn't just cleanliness, it was contradiction. He was supposed to be defeated, humiliated, broken. Yet here he was, choosing soap, buying it, earning it. He lay awake for a long time, staring at the wooden beams above him, the bar of soap resting beside his bunk like proof of a riddle he could not solve. Why would the enemy grant them dignity? Why give freedom in the smallest, most intimate ways? He didn't know. All he knew was that every time he held that bar, he felt both heavier and lighter at once, as if the war had followed him even here, but had changed shape. It was no longer fought with bullets, it was fought with choice, and that, he realized, might be the most dangerous weapon of all. The rain came soft at first, a hush against the rooftops of the camp, then steadier, drumming lightly on the corrugated metal above the barracks. The men had been assigned indoor duties that day, stacking blankets, checking tools, scrubbing mud from boots. But most found themselves loitering in the long corridor between bunks, watching the grey curtain outside. The air inside smelled of damp wool and cigarette smoke. Franz sat near the window, watching droplets race each other down the glass. It should have been another silent afternoon, another hour lost to the hollow ache of waiting. But then something happened. A young British guard, Collins, barely more than a boy, stepped into the barracks doorway with a clipboard tucked under one arm. He looked out of place, boots too shiny, eyes too eager. He cleared his throat, grinning nervously, and raised his voice in the worst German any of them had ever heard. Achtung, Leute, putzen. Your, Schuhe. There was a pause, and then, without warning, the room erupted. Laughter. Real, unguarded, rolling laughter. It spilled out from bunks and benches, from men who hadn't smiled in weeks, who'd hidden every flicker of mirth behind folded arms and silence. Some doubled over. One man clapped his hand against the wall to steady himself. Even Franz couldn't help it. He laughed until his chest ached, the absurdity cutting through every layer of caution. Collins blinked, startled at first. But then he laughed too, red-faced, helpless. He held up both hands as if surrendering to the joke he had unintentionally started, then tried again. Schuhe. Sauber machen. Yes? His accent twisted the vowels like wire, but it didn't matter anymore. The ice was cracked. The room glowed with something new. Language had always been a weapon. A wall, orders shouted in English were meant to confuse, to control. But now, with one mangled sentence, it became something else. A bridge. A moment of shared absurdity between captor and captive. Collins didn't have to try. He could have barked in English and left. But he had made the effort. And in doing so, he offered something rare. Vulnerability. That, Franz realized, was the true reason for the laughter. Not just the sound of butchered grammar, but the recognition of humanity on both sides. A guard willing to look foolish, even briefly, for the sake of understanding. It was more than funny. It was disarming. As the laughter ebbed, the room settled into a different kind of silence. Lighter, almost reverent. A few men wiped at their eyes. One muttered, "He sounded like my cousin when he tried French." Another said, "I never thought I'd laugh again, not like that." And then someone added softly, "Not with them." That them no longer felt like a wall. It had blurred at the edges. In war they had been taught that laughter was weakness, that smiling made you soft, that the enemy must never be understood, only defeated. But here, in the warmth of shared laughter, something shifted. Hate had rules, it had boundaries, it made sense. Laughter did not. It trespassed, it climbed over fences. It dared to suggest that both sides were still made of skin and breath, not just flags and slogans. Franz leaned back, hands behind his head, listening to the rain and the last echoes of that moment. He understood now why the Reich had feared this kind of contact. Because laughter made it harder to kill, harder to hate, harder to hold on to the myth of monsters. And in that laughter something ancient did indeed break. Not loudly, not with ceremony, but with the quiet, astonishing clarity of a joke told across a fence. And answered. It had reminded him, if only for a breath, that even behind fences, the human heart still recognized its own reflection. Winter crept into the camp quietly, with a damp chill that seemed to settle in the bones. Frost slicked the windows each morning, thin and delicate as lace. The prisoners rose before dawn, pulling on wool coats issued by the British, coats once meant for their own soldiers. The irony wasn't lost on them. Franz sometimes caught himself tracing the stitching on his sleeve, wondering which British mother had sewn it, which soldier had worn it before the war took him. The fabric still smelled faintly of smoke and soap, and in some strange way, it felt like wearing someone else's memory. By now the men were cleaner, stronger, calmer. The routine had carved order out of chaos. But inside, another battle was being fought, a quieter, more dangerous one. It was not against the British, or even against the war itself. It was against what lived in their minds, against everything they had been told to believe. Some of the younger men had started learning English, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to understand. They listened to the guards speak, repeating words under their breath, mouthing syllables like prayers. Franz caught one man reading from a torn newspaper, finger following the lines as if tracing the shape of a new world. "What are you doing?" Franz asked. The man hesitated, then said softly, "If I understand their words, maybe I'll understand their hearts." Others refused. One man spat on the ground when he heard English spoken. "You forget who you are," he hissed. "Every word you learn is surrender." But Franz didn't answer. He only watched the young man walk away, shoulders rigid with a pride that looked more like fear. That night, when the camp quieted and the wind howled through the gaps in the roof, Franz pulled a small book from under his mattress, a copy of Hamlet the chaplain had given him weeks ago. He read it slowly, sounding out the words he didn't know, feeling them unfold like secrets. "What a piece of work is man," he whispered into the dark, the irony not lost on him. The war had taught him that honor was obedience, that to question, to bend, was weakness. But in the camp, honor began to feel like something else entirely. The British didn't shout it, didn't demand it. They practiced it, quietly, consistently. They cleaned their boots before shift change. They called the prisoners men. They buried the dead, even German ones, with proper ceremony. Honor here wasn't enforced, it was offered, and that made it harder to resist. Yet for many, the weight of guilt pressed heavier than frost. Letters from home, when they came, were thin and trembling. "We have little food," one read. "Your mother trades soap for bread. The city still smells of smoke." Franz folded the letter carefully, unable to breathe. He had eaten stew that very night. He had washed with warm water. The guilt settled like ash in his throat. How could the enemy feed him when his own country could not feed its children? How could mercy come from the wrong side of the war? In the mess hall one evening, a British sergeant dropped a basket of apples onto the table. "Eat," he said simply, before walking away. The men stared at the fruit as though it were sacred. Franz picked one up, feeling its smooth skin. He thought of his father, who used to polish apples on his sleeve before handing them to him as a boy. Without thinking, Franz whispered, "Danke." The guard turned, half smiling. "You're welcome." It was nothing more than 2 words exchanged between strangers, yet in that moment it felt like the end of something, and the beginning of something else. As the snow deepened and the days shortened, the camp grew quieter still. Conversations drifted from bitterness to reflection. Some of the men began keeping journals. Others helped the guards repair fences, not out of compulsion, but from habit. The hatred that once defined them was wearing thin, replaced by something far more dangerous to every ideology they'd carried in: respect. Franz felt it one evening as he stood outside, breath misting in the cold air, looking at the horizon. The war was ending somewhere beyond that line of trees. He didn't know what would become of him when it did. But for the first time, he understood that captivity could free a man in ways victory never could. Honor, he thought, wasn't what you died for. It was what you learned to give, even to your enemy. The day the gates opened, the air smelled like damp leaves and diesel. No ceremony, no flags. Just a list read aloud, names ticked off, and a line of prisoners handed their possessions: a bar of soap, a wool sweater, a book tucked inside a satchel with initials not their own. The British guards shook hands, some without looking. Others simply nodded. "Safe journey," they said. "All the best." No speeches, just the quiet, disorienting sound of return. Franz boarded the train with a heart full of silence. The car was packed with men who had once worn uniforms and now carried only questions. The countryside outside the window was still green, still impossibly untouched. But as they crossed into the battered edge of Germany, the trees thinned and the scars of war grew sharper. Roofs missing. Fields churned to dust. Smoke still hung in the distance, not from battle now, but from the slow, stubborn work of rebuilding. When they arrived, no one waited at the station. Franz walked through streets he once knew, now barely recognizable. His hometown, what was left of it, was hushed. Rubble spilled across sidewalks. Hollow windows stared like wounds. A woman swept dust from the stoop of a building with no roof. A boy sat on a broken step, eating from a can with his fingers. No one cheered. No one asked how the war had ended. They just watched the returning men like strangers from another world. He found his uncle's house, what remained of it, by following the smell of cabbage water. Inside, a single kerosene lamp flickered on a crate. His uncle stared at him for a long time before saying, "You look fed." It wasn't an accusation. Not exactly. But it wasn't welcome either. That night, Franz sat on the floor, clutching the book he'd brought back. Shakespeare, Hamlet, the same copy he'd read by candlelight in the barracks. His cousin, thin as a blade and wrapped in a threadbare blanket, glanced at it and asked, "Did they make you read that?" Franz shook his head. "No, they gave it to me." Silence stretched. Then the question came. "What did you give them for such kindness?" Franz didn't answer. He couldn't. What could he say? That the British had handed him tea without asking for anything in return? That they had called him Mister even when his own country had only ever called him soldier or son? That they had taught him how to say thank you in their language, and that it had meant more to him than any medal? In the following days, whispers trailed him through the shattered alleys. Other returnees gave him sidelong glances. Some looked thinner. Most looked haunted. The ones who had come back from the Russian front didn't speak at all. One man spat near his feet and muttered, "Must have been nice behind British fences." Franz wanted to scream that it wasn't nice, that every kindness had burned like acid, that every full stomach had come with guilt. But he didn't. He just nodded and walked on. Each night he lay in a borrowed bed, listening to the rats skitter through broken walls, and wondered what he was supposed to feel. Relief? Gratitude? Grief? The war had ended, but the burden of survival was just beginning. How did you carry kindness back into a place built only on loss? He thought again of the guard who'd fumbled German, the bar of soap, the warm tea on a cold morning. None of it made sense here. Here, in the ruins, survival felt like betrayal. And yet, as he lay in the dark, the weight of the book pressed against his chest like a question he couldn't yet answer. Decades passed before he found the words. Time dulled the sound of marching boots and the hum of engines, but not the memory of that strange, inverted world, the world behind British fences where enemies had shown mercy. In the years that followed, historians would fill shelves with statistics and treaties, but none of it could explain what had happened in those camps. The official record called them holding facilities. The men who lived there called them something else entirely, a place that made us think. When the interviews began in the 1960s, the men were old, their uniforms long since traded for factory coats and farmers' jackets. Their voices cracked as they spoke of tea, toast, soap, and laughter, the mundane details that had quietly undone an empire's narrative. They treated us as men, one wrote in his diary. And that frightened me more than any rifle. Another, who had been captured at Caen, scrawled a single sentence in faded ink. I arrived an enemy. I left uncertain. Franz, now in his 70s, kept his own notes hidden inside the same Hamlet he had carried home. The pages had yellowed, the spine cracked. In the margins, his handwriting trembled but steady. The war ended in fire, but something gentler followed, a discipline without hatred. Sometimes he wondered if it had been real at all, that strange civility in captivity. But when he read those lines, he could still smell the rain on the barracks roof, still taste the bitter warmth of tea served by a hand that should have hated him. In the late autumn of 1989, he returned to England for the first time since the war. The camp no longer existed. The fields had been swallowed by housing estates, the fences replaced by hedgerows. But a plaque stood near a small oak tree, placed there by local villagers, site of former prisoner of war camp, 1944 to 1948. Nothing else. Just silence and the faint echo of memory. He walked slowly, leaning on a cane, and when he reached the tree, he knelt with effort. From his coat pocket he pulled a folded note, creased and worn. On it, in his careful German script, were 6 words. "Thank you for my humanity back." He left it beneath the oak roots, weighted with a small stone. As he rose, he thought of the guard who'd laughed over the tangled wire, of the chaplain's quiet prayers, of the apple pressed into his hand by a man he'd once called his enemy. The memories had never left him, not because they were grand, but because they were ordinary. Ordinary kindness in an age of extraordinary cruelty. That, he realized, was what had changed him. Not politics, not surrender, but small acts of decency that refused to fit into the machinery of hate. Historians would later call it moral dissonance. Soldiers who had seen both sides of captivity, who had learned that humanity could exist even in the aftermath of atrocity, found themselves unable to return to the old certainties. Some wrote of guilt, others of gratitude. One simply said, "The British didn't win my loyalty, they restored my conscience." Franz died a year later, his Hamlet still on the bedside table, the note beneath the oak still where he'd left it. The villagers never knew who had placed it there, only that every spring, someone, perhaps another former prisoner, left a single cup of tea beneath the plaque, steaming in the morning mist. And so the story lingered, passed quietly between generations, a paradox folded into history's pages. The war had burned cities, broken nations, and remade borders. But somewhere in that vast ruin, a few men had discovered something harder to destroy than ideology: respect. Because perhaps the greatest weapon in war is not the rifle, or the bomb, or even the flag, but the hand that refuses to strike when it could, the one that offers a cup of tea instead.